who are joining us online throughout the week. We look forward to hopefully seeing you in person someday soon. All right, I'm pretty excited because today we're continuing in our journey through the book of Esther. We'll be in chapter 6 today. We've got to remember where we started. So throughout this series, we've been reminding ourselves that the book of Esther is a biblical narrative, which means it's not necessarily prescriptive in nature, and that's important because when we look at the story, we're looking for the important questions that we should be asking, even amidst some of the not so great actions of some of the characters, or at least not so great situations that some of the characters find themselves in. Esther's a wholly unique book of the Bible because God's not directly mentioned anywhere. Instead, we get to be detectives and looking for ways that God is moving throughout the story. So, in chapter 1, we learned how we should relate to authority and the responsibility that comes for those in positions of authority. In chapter 2, we saw the importance of choosing your friends and advisors wisely. Chapter 3 taught us to resist the evil of the world that we're in with goodness. Chapter 4 showed us that it takes awareness and risk and wisdom to affect change. Last week, Chaz talked to us about the importance of self-control and how we can resist some of those impulses that we have, but with joy and patience instead. Throughout each of the chapters, the suspense in our story is building, and today we hit the turning point of the story. So before we do that, let's pray. Lord, thank you that we have been on this journey, learning more about your heart through the story of Esther and through what we can learn in that story. Lord, we ask that you come and be with us today. Help us to be detectives and to see your hand moving as we look at the next piece of the story. Amen. All right. The story of Esther plays out in my mind kind of like a TV miniseries. So welcome to my mind. We're going TV miniseries today. Perhaps it's one of those period dramas that has castles and lords and ladies at court with a lot of political intrigue. VBS really connects really well. We're in a castle, y'all. So I need you to imagine the introduction of the show for this episode. Today's episode opens with a scene showing Haman's men sharpening a huge 75-foot pole in the pre-dawn morning. They're hurrying for fear of the wrath of their master, Haman. Now, Haman only ordered this done last night, but the servants know that he is on his way to King Xerxes this morning to ask the king to impale Mordecai on this giant pole. So it has to be ready. Cut to the theme music and the recap. Previously on Esther, we see that King Xerxes threw a huge party and banished Queen Vashti, and then threw a giant beauty pageant in search of a new queen. Esther, who's secretly a Jew, wins the pageant in the favor of the king and becomes the new queen. Early in her role as queen, her uncle Mordecai staves off an assassination plot to kill the king. Life goes on, and this character, Haman the Agagite, rises to power. He becomes honored above all of the other noblemen. Haman and Mordecai have beef. A lot of beef. And Haman uses his influence over the king to declare or to decree the destruction of all of the Jews in about a year's time from when that decree went out. Okay, so that's where we are. Last week, right before that, we're in a space everyone is going to be destroyed. Mordecai has a conversation with Esther because she's his niece, and he helps inspire her to step out in faith and risk everything to save the Jews. Subplot here, right? So last week the tensions are building. Esther is doing this task. She steps out in faith by throwing a big party for the king and Haman. Now, the king's gotten a little suspicious. He keeps saying, Esther, what's going on here? But she has promised last week to answer all of his questions, let them know all of her motives behind these multi-day banquets soon. So everything looks promising, but then last week it was clouded by this final scene where Haman's rage flares up because he saw Mordecai, who was continuing to disrespect him. So, enter chapter 6, this week's episode. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed a plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who's that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived into the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman's out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing that you have suggested. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all of his friends what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man, has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. And while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet that Esther has prepared. So this story's full of drama and suspense. That's why I like it so much. But the real question of the day is, what can we learn from all of these events? And where can we see God's hand moving in this story? The opening scene of this chapter shows Xerxes unable to sleep. So he has the servants read to him, presumably to help him fall asleep, I guess. We're not really sure why he chose to listen to the history of his reign. Perhaps that's a moment of inspiration from the Spirit. While listening to the history, the story of Mordecai saving him from assassination kind of jumps out at him, and he realizes nothing's been done to recognize Mordecai for this service. This too might be another moment of inspiration from the Spirit. Now, it's presumably been a little while since that assassination plot happened. I tried, because I'm a nerd like this, but I couldn't find a specific date in the text or anywhere on the internet. But as you read through the book of Esther, you realize that that assassination plot happens pretty shortly after her marriage to the king. So we know that it's kind of there. And in this scene, it's been some time. So we've got some time has passed since that occurred. And we get to see our first takeaway happen in this scene. Our first takeaway is the truth will always be revealed. As you read verses 1 through 3, there's a few things that I noticed right away as I read it. The first thing is the obvious truth part, that Mordecai saved the king's life, and the king didn't really pick up on it, but now he finally has realized that that has happened, and that the king's like, oh my goodness, I didn't do anything to recognize him. So that's the obvious truth. But the thing that I also noticed is that nowhere in verses 1 through 3, or really anywhere else in the book of Esther, do we see Mordecai really doing anything to complain or to say anything about the fact he wasn't recognized. So that it is a truth that he did this thing, he saved the king. It's a truth he wasn't recognized, but we don't see Mordecai complaining about this specific thing. It just kind of happened. It's kind of a quiet truth. It's just kind of one of those like quiet, hidden truths. Maybe it's just hidden because of memory loss or, all the other distractions of ruling a kingdom. Just a passing good deed that has happened. But it is the truth of the situation. Now, if I was Mordecai, I might be tempted to be just a little bit bitter. He saved the king's life. He didn't get any reward, any recognition. Nothing good really came from it. And actually, I'd be even extra bitter if I was Mordecai, sitting in this space where I'm a Jew, and there's this decree that says we're all going to get destroyed here shortly. So I might be a little bit like, hold up, I've done some things to help you, but that's not how Mordecai reacted. Sure, he had some other less wonderful interactions with Haman, who's the king's man, but that's not related to this specific topic. I think here maybe Mordecai is showing some of that self-control and that patience that Chaz talked to us about last week. Or at least Mordecai has that trust in God that it's all good. I don't need anything for this. I acted how you would have me act in that moment. But yet, the king finally has the realization, as he's listening to this history of his reign, the truth is revealed. Not only is he reminded that he was saved, he realizes, ooh, I really need to thank Mordecai. And that kind of connects in my brain to Luke chapter 8, the parable of the lamp. In Luke 8, verse 16 and 17, it says, no one lights a lamp and then covers it with a bowl or hides it under a bed. A lamp is placed on a stand where its light can be seen by all who enter the house. For all that is secret will eventually be brought out into the open, and everything that is concealed will be brought to light and made known to all. Mordecai was not hiding the truth. He just wasn't throwing it in anybody's face. He's just like a little quiet candle light sitting over here. But all of a sudden it shines brighter, for the king anyway, and everything that was kind of hidden becomes known to all. Now Jesus tells that parable so that eventually, we know that eventually everything that is secret is made known, and that it's not really the only time he speaks of revealing truth. In Luke chapter 12, he tells his disciples, he's actually warning them about the yeast of the Pharisees in this section, but he does tell them the time is coming when everything that is covered up will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. So whatever you've said in the dark will be heard in the light, and whatever you've whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops for all to hear. So again, we see Jesus, we're being told truth, it will come to light. Eventually, it's coming to light. Now, we may have experienced this for ourselves a few times in our life. Perhaps for you it was a situation like Mordecai, where it's just an unknown great deed, and it becomes known. Or, for some of us, it could be that type of truth that Jesus was talking about in Luke 12, where the truth is revealing a lie or some sort of undesirable action. Either way, I hope it inspires you. Because if you're waiting for a great truth to be revealed, like Mordecai, just keep waiting patiently and be comforted knowing the truth is going to be revealed. If you're waiting for a truth to be revealed that's from a situation that's less desirable, be comforted knowing the truth will eventually be revealed. Now, in our day-to-day actions, that also means we need to remember the truth will be revealed, so choose your actions wisely. Demonstrate that wisdom and patience and love we've been talking about over the past few weeks. Okay, back to the story. Enter Haman on the scene. The king just has an epiphany and wants to recognize Mordecai, but how? Might as well ask one of his most trusted nobles, Haman. Remember, Haman's already on his way to visit the king to ask if he can impale Mordecai on a 75-foot spike. I don't know why the spike has to be so big, but a 75-foot spike, just because Mordecai disrespected him. Again. So Haman is called by the king and asked his opinion on how best to honor someone who pleases the king. And verses 6 through 9 are chef's kiss. Perfect for those of us reading the story here in the reader or the viewer. Because we've grown to see Haman as kind of the villain. And this is what we get. Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replies, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's old robes and so on and so on and so on. All of these grand, lavish things. So perfect. Because Haman's motives are so evident to us. We get to be the reader or the audience. We can see everything. We can see his arrogance and his pride just in that little statement of, well, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? And then Haman and all of those lavish suggestions just keeps it all coming. It becomes that turning point because it backfires in verse 10. And I think this turning point is something that we as humans must really connect to, because this type of scenario is what you find in countless movies and TV shows and books. It's like classic in literature, right? Where you've got the villain of the story, and us as the audience can see all of the not great things going on with this villain. And then there's something that happens, and everything shifts, and we know the villain is about to be revealed. Because you see, motives are funny like that. We can try to hide them, but just like the truth, true motives will always be revealed. Now, the Bible has a whole bunch to say about motives. Like, you could be Googling forever. Might as well just read all of Proverbs and all of Psalms. There's a lot to be said about motives. And we're told that the Lord examines our motives. So in Proverbs 16:2, we're told, people may be pure in their own eyes, but the Lord examines their motives. 1 Samuel 2:3, stop acting so proud and haughty. Don't speak with such arrogance, for the Lord is the God who knows what you have done, and he will judge your actions. Romans chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. For sinful nature is always hostile to God. It never did obey God's laws, and it never will. That's why those who are still under the control of their sinful nature can never please God. The Lord will judge our actions and examine our motives. If our motives are not pure, then our actions are not going to be pleasing to God. I could have kept going, but I thought you probably didn't want me to read the whole Old Testament to you today. So let's talk about motives for a second. Growing up, my dad had this story that he always loved to tell me from when I was a toddler. So I'm going to share it with you today. Apparently, one day, my dad had been working out in the yard, and my little brother was napping, and we'd all, my dad and I had come inside, and I proceeded to tell my dad, "Daddy, you stink. You should take a shower." Now, I was probably 2, maybe 2.5, something like that when this happened. But my dad could tell by my insistence that he needed to take a shower that something was up. So like parents do, he wanted to see how this would play out. See if he could figure out what my motives were. So he hid in the bathroom, cracked the door just a little bit, turned on the water. And he just kind of watched and waited. And as soon as little 2-year-old Reagan thought the coast was clear, which might have been 10 seconds later, because toddlers, she beelined it for Mom's makeup drawer. Yeah. About the time I opened the tube of lipstick and started to put it on is when Dad pops out of the bathroom. So I was caught red-handed, or rather red-lipped, playing with Mom's makeup. Backfired on him. It took me another 20 years to bother putting on makeup again. But anyway, at that moment, my dad had figured out my true little toddler motives for attempting to convince him that he was stinky and needed a shower. He might have still been stinky and needed a shower, guys. Who knows? Okay, but the truth had been revealed. What's funny is I don't remember that event as the toddler self, right? So I don't know all the full details from my own personal side, but I've heard it enough times that I remember it. But I have had enough similar events in my life where I might have made similar poor choices as a kid that I do remember, that I can remember that feeling when your impure motives are revealed and you get caught in some sort of an act. That little pit of panic that you get right in your stomach. And I bet that's exactly how Haman was feeling in this story. That little pit of panic just building in his stomach. The moment he realizes the king wanted to honor someone else and not him. Verse 10, "Do everything you said for Mordecai." Okay. Great. Again, we get to be the reader of this story. It'd be way more fun than actually being in the story. So thankfully, not all motives are pride and arrogance and hatred like Haman, as shown in our story. We get to have the fruit of the Spirit, so we can also have motives that help us act in love and joy, peace, and patience, and kindness, and goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Kathy taught a song to the kids. I can't not say the fruit of the Spirit, kind of like love, joy, peace, patience. See, those, when they are our motives, are also revealed through our actions. And knowing that motives matter leads us to the question of, how do I know if my motives are actually good? Psalms 139 gives us kind of a straightforward answer to that question. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life." It's straightforward because we simply just have to ask God to search our hearts and point out the motives that offend him. But in reality, maybe it's not that easy, or at least it doesn't always feel easy to us. I've spent the past 25 plus years meditating on these 2 verses. They're the first thing I ever bookmarked in my Bible. And what I've learned through prayer and worship and the wise counsel of godly people is that these 2 verses are an ongoing conversation with God. They require us to lay down our need to be right or our need to be in control, and instead ask God, How is he leading us? What step does he want us to take along our path with him? And to ask him to fill us with his Spirit so that the fruit of his Spirit is what pours out of us instead. I would encourage you today to take some time in prayer and ask God those questions, to search my heart, Lord, to ask him to point out if there's anything that he wants to point out to you today. And if he is pointing something out, then consider getting prayer during our response time later. That's no small thing. Opening that can of worms and saying, God, search my heart. Point out things that I might need to know. It's not a small thing, but it's an important thing. All right. Brings us to the last scene of today's story. The king orders Haman to honor Mordecai in all the lavish ways that Haman has described. Imagine Haman carrying out those orders. He's probably barely able to control his emotions as he gets to go throughout the kingdom, shouting where everyone can hear of Mordecai's favor and honor from the king. And when it's finally over, Haman returns home absolutely defeated and dejected and just humiliated. And it was only the day before when he had come home so excited because he was a special guest at a banquet with the king and queen. And today he had to go through this mini parade shouting the praises of his most hated enemy. Now, as a contrast, Mordecai's the one who is getting to be rewarded. And as I mentioned earlier, he wasn't really pushing for this, so this is a surprise special day for Mordecai. He saved the king years ago. The king realizes this truth, and what he thought he was doing today is not what he did. Instead, he rode around town in a mini parade, all for him, with the king honoring him. That's not a bad surprise of the day for Mordecai. And so the next thing that we learn in our story, the truth is always revealed, but pride goes before the fall, and the humble will be rewarded. That saying, the pride goes before the fall, actually comes from the Bible. It's in Proverbs 16. Verse 18, we see pride goes before destruction and haughtiness before the fall, or before a fall. But in contrast, shortly later, in verse 20, we see those who listen to instruction will prosper, and those who trust the Lord will be joyful. There are two characters right there in the book of Proverbs. Now this Proverbs is echoed as well in Matthew 23:12. It says, but those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Again, our two characters right there. We can expect that that motive of pride is going to lead us to destruction. But we can also expect that acting in accordance with God's will leads to prosperity, since the truth of our motives will ultimately be revealed. So as followers of God, we should really hunger for the truth. God's showing us here the two sides to this coin. One side leads to destruction and the forced humility, and the other, for those who are seeking truth, promises joy and prosperity. And that's what gives me hope and leads me to ask God to search my heart and to reveal to me those areas for growth. Because I want to live in this side of the coin over here that leads to joy. Remember a couple of weeks ago when Chaz talked to us about the importance of choosing our friends wisely because of the importance of wise godly counsel? This is done by being connected to one another. Getting to know people requires us being in community and in relationship with one another, because it's there where we learn to support each other in love, and we can foster a culture of truth through transparency and accountability and reliance on God's wisdom. That's what helps us be on this side of the coin, because we're not alone in this. Getting connected to people starts with spending time with people. That could be in things like small groups, going out to church, or going after church, come to church first, go after church, go out to lunch with your friends, or volunteer at something like VBS. Spend time with people so that you have that community with you. All right. Throughout the book of Esther, we, the reader, get to see those glimpses into the motives of each of the characters as we kind of go through the story. The characters themselves are hiding behind their masks or their facades for lots of different reasons and lots of different motives. They're all kind of hidden when they interact with each other. Whether it's all of their motives or just some of them, they're still kind of under these masks. Esther hides her identity as a Jewish woman. The king, well, he's got a crown to hide behind. Haman masks his pride and arrogance. He also twists the story as to why Jews should be destroyed. He makes it just about simple disobedience when truly he had a pretty deep hatred for Mordecai and the Jews. I think Chaz even mentioned to us, because Haman's an Agagite, and Mordecai's a Jew, and like this is not just like a little we hate each other now. This is like historical, generational hatred. And even Mordecai, who is set up to be the good guy in our story, he encourages Esther to hide truths about herself and extremely poorly hides his disdain for Haman. Generational hatred. So on the flip side, we've got Mordecai's motives for saving the king coming to light, and those were good ones, and he does get rewarded for that. But there's some less wonderful moments with that character as well. Everyone seems to have these kind of like secret and hidden components of themselves throughout the entire story. Which goes with this idea that the truth is going to be revealed and our motives are going to be revealed because they have to be somewhat hidden in the first place. And we as humans, we often use these masks or facades as a way to try to hide all or part of ourselves. But the thing with masks and facades is they're always going to break. Eventually the truth comes out. This includes our true motives, which could be our downfall if they're from something like pride and jealousy and hatred, like Haman. Or we could be masking beauty in our joy of the Lord. And then we're hiding that and not sharing that with those around us. Because that happens too. And a lot of it's because the idea of that pain of losing the mask would happen. But the pain of losing a mask is way worse, the pain of losing the mask is worse than the pain of being seen in the first place, if that makes sense. Like, the pain of this thing I was holding on to being ripped away hurts more than you just knowing what I was about in the first place. And we hear about truth over and over in the Bible. And we hear that when we hold on to God's truth and we let Him teach us, we get to experience what Jesus tells us in John 8:32, the truth will set you free. If you have a choice between putting on a mask and letting yourself be seen as you are, choose to be seen. Just choose to live in truth, because in truth there's freedom. Way more cozy. Throughout chapter 6, we get to watch Haman's mask begin to crumble. Just because the king realizes the truth about Mordecai. It's kind of like we're watching a pot full of water that's starting to boil. The events of the story and the characters are all in this pot. And although God's not directly mentioned, we can easily see how he's heating up this pot of water through the events. We've got the interplay between events that's just kind of too perfect to be random. The king's inability to sleep, which leads him to reading the story of the history of his kingdom and finally realize all of this stuff about about Mordecai. Little tiny bubbles right there on the bottom of your pot. Haman just happens to be out in the courtyard in the moment the king needs advice on how to honor someone. Water's heating up. There's a few more bubbles going on. And then it's this perfect setup. The whole conversation is a perfect setup for Haman to start to show his true colors when he realizes that Mordecai is the one being honored. So the water's really getting hot, and you've got like lots of those little tiny bubbles are starting to come to the top. It just keeps going and going. That heat, that's where I see God moving in this story, is because there's no way this can be random. It's just too perfect. Because you see, our God is a God of truth. And it's through him that truth is revealed. And it's to him that we turn to seek truth, even about ourselves. It's his guidance that we need to be able to act in pure motives, because it's his guidance that's going to allow the fruit of his Spirit to flow out of us. And most importantly, in this pursuit of truth, we're not alone. Not only is there a community of believers there to support us, but Jesus is there too. So chapter 6 ends on a cliffhanger. We haven't seen the complete end to Haman's story yet. We can see that he is falling. We can see the pot of water has almost reached a complete boil. Even his wife and friends realize that it would be fatal for him to kind of keep pushing this issue to continue to oppose Mordecai. So the people around him can see the pot of water is starting to boil. And then we get the cliffhanger moment where Haman's taken away to yet another banquet that's hosted by Esther with the king. Spoiler alert, it gets worse for him next week. But that's where we're going to leave it today. It's in the tension of, okay, we're in this tension. Stuff is coming to light. Not always cozy to sit in tension. But sometimes it's exactly what we need. Because without a little bit of tension, sometimes I forget to ask God to search my heart. Sometimes I forget to hand to him like, hey, this stuff, show me what you see instead of what I see. Because sometimes I have to be uncomfortable first. I hope you don't live in that space, but I have to be poked a lot before I pay attention. I'm trying to grow out of that. But that's where we get to be right now. We get the spoiler of knowing there's good in the end. But it's not really a spoiler when the whole Bible tells you that. That yes, truth is revealed. Yes, it's not good if you're on the wrong side of this. But yes, there's hope. Yes, he will search us and lead us and guide us, because his Spirit will lead us to all of the goodness and the freedom in truth. And that's where we want to press in today. And this is the point in our service where we make room for the Holy Spirit to work, to respond to him. That's the space where you press into him and say, Lord, I want to be on this side over here, learning about how you would help me grow in your love, in your joy, in your peace. I'm going to have to hand it to you, God, because that means I'm going to have to let go of being in control. I'm going to have to let go of whatever my personal thoughts were, if there's a thing that you want to work on with me, God. Because I want to be here, help me to get here. So in this space to respond, that's something I would encourage you to have that conversation with God. Like, okay, Lord, am I on this side or not? We're humans. If I learned anything about reading, as we read through the story of the Israelites in the Old Testament, humans are not perfect. There's a good chance parts of you may have a space that you need to press into with him. All right. Before we do all that, we're going to start with communion. So if you're a follower of Jesus, we have communion available. We've got some up here at the front. We've got a table at the back. There's little things written on the top that say gluten-free if you're gluten sensitive, so those are available too. So at this time, if you would grab those elements and then bring them back to your seats, we're going to take communion together in just a little bit.